It's fair to say that Baku was an absolute disaster for Red Bull. They lost the lead in the Constructors' Championship for the first time since Spain 2022. Checo, whilst having by far the best weekend of his season, crashed out in the closing laps. And I can't quite believe that I'm saying this, but Max was also having a terrible weekend in which he underperformed as well. I have said multiple times this year that looking back, Miami really felt like the first proper race of 2024, and in a strange way, the 5 races before Miami was almost like 2023.5, if that makes sense. In the 12 races since then, Perez hasn't scored a single podium, Max has only won 3 races, and now, whilst I think that Max will comfortably win the Drivers' Championship, looking at how much the performance of McLaren and Ferrari has converged, not only has Red Bull been overtaken by McLaren, but with Ferrari only 31 points behind with 7 races still to go, I think it's now becoming more likely that Red Bull will also finish in 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. Baku was a really strange weekend because for the first time in what feels like maybe 2 or 3 years, Checo was genuinely the faster driver from start to finish, and that's not to say that the Red Bull was a good car because yes, it was better than the Mercedes who had their own tyre issues with both of their drivers, but it still wasn't anywhere near either the Ferrari or McLaren. Over the past few races, Max has been complaining about similar issues, which he described in Baku as a lack of bite, basically meaning that when he turns the wheel, the front tyres just don't turn in as sharp as he wants to. And now I first noticed this back in Zandvoort when riding on board with Max, as through certain corners when he turned the wheel, the car just picked up noticeable understeer and struggled to turn in. And now this is not the first time that we have seen similar characteristics in the Red Bull. We saw it at the beginning of 2022, beginning of 2023, and when the car has had these driving characteristics, Checo has often been closer to Max. However, in Baku, Checo wasn't just closer, he was outright faster. Max did admit that throughout practice, the minor floor upgrade that the team brought did make the car a little bit better compared to Monza, but to try to help with the understeer, the team decided to make a suspension change going into qualifying, which, although helped with the turn-in, had negative side effects of really bad bouncing. I think we were heading in the right direction, but then the changes that we made before qualifying tipped it over the edge. We paid the price for that in the race. The car was jumping around a lot, the wheels were coming off the ground in the low-speed corners, you lose contact patch with the tarmac, which you don't want. That then caused me to slide a lot more, overheat the tyres more, and there was no way to drive around it, so the pace was just a bit all over the place. Checo, on the other hand, didn't make the same setup changes that Max did going into quali, because he was already comfortable with the car and had by far the best weekend of his season so far, at least in terms of pace. In the race, whilst he was in the process of attacking Leclerc because his tyres had clearly fallen off, I don't think he ever looked capable of actually overtaking for the win, but regardless, it was yet another reminder of how cruel motorsport can be because you can do everything right for 99% of the weekend, and then with a couple of laps to go, it is all gone and you are in the barrier with no points. On the collision itself, after looking at every single camera angle 1,000,001 times, firstly, both drivers are clearly trying their best to catch the slipstream from Leclerc ahead, and so both are essentially trying to fight for the same racing line, but to me Sainz was a little bit more at fault because I do think he's drifting slightly over towards Checo when Checo is already more in Leclerc's slipstream and already far enough alongside Sainz. However, I don't think that Sainz is predominantly to blame, and so in the end, I think both have a little bit of culpability, and so I don't mind that the stewards deemed it a racing incident. I must say, however, that coming away from this weekend, I really do feel for Checo. Now let me preface this by saying that I know that he is the reason that Red Bull are even in danger of finishing 3rd. I know that he has underperformed this season and that turning up for one race in the last 12 isn't exactly anything to shout about, and I know that if Red Bull had a better option available, he probably wouldn't even be in the car right now. But I think that he showed a lot of character to perform as well as he did, despite all of the justified criticism that he's received, and it's just unfortunate that his performance went unrewarded. And now, it's too early to say definitively what effect Baku will have on Checo's future. Horner himself said after the summer break when the team kind of chose to keep him on, that they expected Checo to be stronger around tracks like Baku and Singapore relative to Max. And even Max around Spa time came out and defended Checo and said that the team's main concern should be their car rather than Checo. What also helped him is the fact that just as Red Bull has gotten worse and he has got closer to Max, Ricciardo, who was clearly lined up to replace Checo, is driving for an RB team that itself is in decline performance-wise, and so he is not able to fight for any headline-grabbing results because the car is no longer capable of them. In terms of the long term, over the next 2 or 3 years, and especially for 2026, there is still no way that Checo can be kept on. We are seeing right now in the Constructors' Championship with McLaren and Ferrari what effect having a better driver lineup can have. But speaking about next year, if Checo can continue to capitalize over the next few races, not necessarily needing to be faster than Max like he was in Baku, but just continue to be closer, it takes more pressure off his shoulders and it continues to take the spotlight away from him and more on the underperformance of the RB20. Red Bull now faces a really difficult and also bizarre rest of the season because nothing that we have seen yet in terms of upgrades suggests that they'll be able to fix the balance issues that they've introduced. Reverting back to an older spec, so for example going back to the car that they had at the start of the year, also isn't really an option, because in that time the rest of the grid has not stood still and have all developed. Yes, we have seen the likes of Mercedes and Baku, for example, take off the floor that they introduced in Monza and go back to the floor that they had in Spa, but even that wasn't enough to make them competitive, and so understanding the problem is Red Bull's primary focus now. To be honest, I am not even slightly worried that Max is at risk of losing the driver's title because the gap in points is still fairly comfortable, and now that we have Lando, Charles and Oscar, and I'm sure other drivers as well, all fighting for wins in the remaining races, they are all taking points away from each other, and so the real fight now is actually for P2 in the Drivers' Championship, with Lando definitely not certain to hold on. There is a situation where Max still wins the driver's title despite the team finishing down in 3rd in the Constructors. We all know, however, that that's not the fault necessarily of the car itself over the course of the year, taking into account that it was dominant for a period of it, and it will more so reflect a failure on the side of Checo. The last time Max Verstappen won a race was back in Spain, which just seems crazy after last year we basically all got to memorize the Dutch national anthem pretty much every single weekend. But I think what's more worrying is what this means for Red Bull going into next year. They will still have a second driver problem that they'll have to tackle, and if they don't show progress of being able to add performance onto their car without inducing bad driving characteristics, they might not even be able to contend for the title. And so where does that then leave Max Verstappen? And now with Singapore up next, I really do think that it'll be a case of it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the car in its current spec is weaker around slow speed corners and in particular when the track is bumpy, and Singapore is a combination of both of those things. That's not to say that the RB20 is a total disaster. Before Max made those setup changes ahead of quali, his race pace throughout practice was actually a lot more promising, and so I think nailing the setup will be their main priority in Singapore. With Austin following Singapore, that should be a track that at least allows Max to be back contending for podiums, and they're going to have to capitalize on the higher downforce tracks like Austin, Mexico and Sao Paulo to hold on to that second place in the Constructors, because apart from the Drivers' Championship, at this current moment, that is the maximum that Red Bull look to be capable of. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.